Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. I think it's safe to say that these two devices right here are the most popular budget handhelds available right now. And on the left we have the Anbernic RG35XX, and on the right we have the Miyoo Mini Plus. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if you would confuse these two, because they are very similar in many ways. For example, they can emulate the same systems. They can basically play up to PlayStation 1 and below. Additionally, they have very similar form factors and are around the same price as well. And my goal in this video here is to actually help you determine which one is going to be the best fit for you if you are interested in maybe buying one of these. Now, I've done full in-depth reviews of both of these devices already here on this channel, and I'll leave those linked in the video description below. All the same, this comparison video here is going to be very comprehensive, and so you should be able to dive right in here and determine just from this video alone. That being said, we're going to go really into depth here, so make sure you grab yourself a bag of Funyuns and maybe a drink, and let's get started. Okay, let's start with availability and pricing. Now, as of releasing this video today, the Miyoo Mini Plus should officially release within the next day or two. And the official way to buy the Miyoo Mini Plus is directly from their store on AliExpress. Now, as you can see right now, as of making this recording, the listing isn't available yet, but as it does come available, I will leave it in the video description below. Now, the original Miyoo Mini was a very popular product, and it ran out of stock all the time, and so I'm expecting the same with the Miyoo Mini Plus. And so another way you could get this console is through a pre-order from a site like KeepRetro.com. What they'll do here is they'll collect your order, and then once they have it in stock, they'll ship it out to you. And so if you want to guarantee a unit and they're out of stock on AliExpress, this is going to be the route to go. And the pricing for the Miyoo Mini Plus should be between $65 and $70 depending on where you buy it. Now, the RG35XX has been out for a few months now, so it's much easier to grab. For example, you could pick it up directly on the Anbernic website for $56 plus shipping, although it does say right now on their website that there will be a delay in delivery by 1 to 2 weeks. You can also pick it up from the AliExpress store. This one's going to be $64 but with free shipping. And then finally, you can also pick it up from resellers available on Amazon. Personally, I would recommend getting one that's Amazon Prime. That way it's going to be very easy to return in case there's something wrong with your device. But bear in mind, you will pay a premium for that convenience and fast shipping. I would expect to pay between $80 and $90 altogether. Either way, you have many options when it comes to buying one of these devices, and I'll leave all the links below. Now, the RG35XX comes in 3 different colors. We have a retro gray, as well as transparent white and transparent purple. Now, I personally have not had my hands on the transparent purple, but it does look pretty nice in photos. And here's a look at the other two, which I do have on hand. Now, usually I'm a big fan of transparent devices, and I usually will prefer them over others, but in this case specifically, I actually like the retro gray one more. Number one, I think it has a more retro and vintage look to it, but then also Anbernic has glued the battery to the back of the device. Now, you can't really see that with the gray one, but with the white one, you can see the glue right there, and I just think that's a little bit tacky. And so if I had to choose between the 3 different colors, I would pick the retro gray one overall. Now, the Miyoo Mini Plus comes in 4 different colors. There's also a retro gray option, but then there's also a white one with these nice rainbow colored buttons. Additionally, we have transparent purple and transparent black models to choose from as well. And the review unit I got from KeepRetro.com is this transparent black. And I do really like the look of this one here. It has a nice smoky finish to it, and so I think this is probably one of my favorites overall. Now, in terms of texture, the RG35XX has a little bit more of a gritty plastic feel to it. And to me, this feels very premium and grippy, and so I really like the feel of the plastic here. The Miyoo Mini Plus also has some pretty good plastic, but it is quite a bit more slick than the other. And it's exactly like how it was with the original Miyoo Mini, and I don't think it's a bad thing in particular, but it can get quite slippery if your hands get sweaty. Now, looking at the overall design between the two, you can see they're obviously modeled after the original Game Boy or Game Boy devices. They have the same 3.5-inch screen with a 480p resolution, and the button layout is just about the same as well. Really, the only main difference between the two, at least on the front here, is that the RG35XX is taller, and so it has a larger chin on the bottom. But when you turn it on its side, there are quite a few differences. To start, they are of varying thicknesses. For example, here at the top, the thinnest part here is about 16 millimeters for the Miyoo Mini Plus, but it's actually thinner up top with the 35XX at only about 14.5 millimeters. But the thing that makes the 35XX stand out more than the other is that it has these flared shoulder and trigger buttons. And so this creates a little bit of a lip right here at the edge of the shoulders and triggers. Alternatively, the design on the Miyoo Mini Plus has the shoulder and trigger buttons sitting flush with the rest of the console. And so as a result, when you set the 35XX on a table, it's going to sit at an angle. In fact, when you push on the top of it, it has a little bit of a seesaw kind of quality to it. Meanwhile, the Miyoo Mini Plus will sit flat on a table, which I actually prefer. Now, it will still tilt back if you push on the top of it, but not as much as the 35XX. One thing that surprised me is that the Miyoo Mini Plus is actually thicker than the other. If you take into account the D-pad as well as the overall thickness of the case, we're looking at about 25mm of thickness. Meanwhile, if we take the thickest part of the 35XX, which is where those shoulder buttons flare out, we're still at under 24.5. In fact, if you look at the place where you actually hold the Miyoo Mini, so for example the back case as well as the face buttons, it's only about 22mm altogether. Now in the end, I don't think this is a huge difference. What it really comes down to is whether or not the device is going to be pocketable. And as you can see here with the Miyoo Mini Plus, I would consider it to be definitely pocketable here. It definitely has a thicker quality to it than say something like a cell phone, but it's still relatively easy to get in and out of my pocket. And that goes for both the front pockets here on these pants as well as on the back pocket too. Now the 35XX is a little bit harder to actually get in the pocket. And that mostly has to do with the fact that the lip on the shoulder buttons will sometimes catch on the edge of my pocket when I'm sliding it in. In the end, I think these are both pocketable, and maybe the 35XX is just a little bit more uncomfortable in that regard. Either way, I do think this size works out really well if you just want to throw it in your pocket while you're walking around. In both respects, I wouldn't want to sit down with this thing in my pocket, but it still works. As a comparison, here's the original Miyoo Mini. As you can see, this one's much smaller and way easier to pocket. And so if you're hoping that one of these devices will be as easy to get in and out of your pocket as this one here, unfortunately that's just not the case. In terms of weight, they're just about the same. We have 166 grams with the Anbernic and 162 with the Miyoo Mini Plus. Okay, moving over to the controls, we'll start with the D-pad. In terms of overall size, the Miyoo Mini Plus is a little bit smaller and fatter than the other. Again, the difference is not much. We're talking about 0.5 millimeter right here. In terms of feel, these both have rubber membrane connection, and I would say the Anbernic one is a little bit stiffer. Personally, I kind of like a stiff rubber membrane D-pad like this, and so I actually really like this feel. By comparison, the Miyoo Mini Plus has a little bit less travel on the D-pad and feels a lot easier to press down on. And again, this also feels really good. I think they both have a very classic retro feel. Now, one of the things I pointed out in my review is that the Miyoo Mini Plus is better at avoiding accidental diagonals in certain games. For example, with Contra, if I press down and then try to wiggle it back and forth, my character will move from time to time, but it's nowhere near as bad as it is on the RG35XX. In the end, I think it's very hard for manufacturers to get correct diagonals when it comes to D-pads. After all, you don't want to make it too hard to get a diagonal, but at the same time, you don't want to make it too easy either. But still, in comparison of the two, I think that Miyoo got it better. Now, all the same, when it comes to actual gameplay, I've never had a moment with the 35XX where I felt to myself, man, that's a diagonal I didn't want to hit. I know there are many people who are sensitive to this, but for me and my playstyle, I just haven't found it. My typical way of testing a diagonal is going to be with a Capcom fighting game like Darkstalkers here. But as you can see, both doing the Hadouken as well as the Shoryuken moves on both the 35XX and the Miyoo Mini are just about the same. I would say that for both of these D-pads, I have about a 95% accuracy altogether. And so if you are specifically concerned about accidental diagonals, then yeah, maybe the Miyoo Mini Plus is going to be a better deal. But for me in particular, it has not been a deal breaker. For example, when playing a game like Golden Sun that has 8-way controls, you can see right here that I can navigate all of these different diagonals absolutely no problem. And to me, it feels very intuitive on both of these two systems. In the end, I think that these are both very good D-pads, but the Miyoo Mini Plus is more accurate. Okay, now let's move over to the face buttons. Now there's not a lot to say right here. They're both about the same size at about 8mm altogether, and they both have glossy buttons with a rubber membrane connection that feels very good in the hand. In comparing the two, the Anbernic buttons are definitely stiffer than the Miyoo ones, but not by much. In the end, I think these are both very good buttons, and it just comes down to personal preference. For me, I prefer the softer touch on the Miyoo Mini Plus. Now the menu buttons on the 35XX are rubber membrane connections and feel a lot like the D-pad and face button as well. And I incorrectly said it in my Miyoo Mini Plus review, but these are actually dome switches on this one. The thing is, they're actually a very soft click, and so initially I actually thought they were rubber membranes. Either way, these menu buttons are fine on both devices. Now moving to the back, we have some larger differences here. For example, the trigger buttons are taller than the shoulder buttons on the Miyoo Mini Plus, which gives the whole thing kind of a rounded feel. And I actually really like this setup because it makes it very easy to know which button you're going to press down on when you're holding it like this. I also like the fact that they're relatively small because it does make it more pocketable. Now the Anbernic buttons are all of the same height, but the shoulder buttons are a little bit wider, and like I showed before, they have a bit of a ski slope kind of angle to them. It's still pretty easy to press either of these buttons, but you will usually press the shoulder buttons with the meat of your index fingers. Again, it's not a bad setup, but I would definitely prefer the Miyoo Mini one over this. Now also on the back here, you can see there is easy access to the battery on the Miyoo Mini Plus. And so replacing this battery would be relatively easy down the line. Now the battery size is also larger on the Miyoo Mini Plus. It's 3000 mAh versus 2100. And that means you can expect about 6 hours of gameplay on the Miyoo Mini Plus and about 4 hours on the 35XX. And so if battery life is a priority to you, then the Miyoo Mini Plus is going to last about 50% longer than the 35XX. Now, one of the issues with the original Miyoo Mini was the fact that it didn't feel very sturdy, especially the back plate that holds the battery. Well, you may have seen in my review, but the back plate on the Miyoo Mini Plus is much sturdier. In fact, these are both very sturdy devices now. But another difference here is that the back buttons on the RG35XX are a little bit looser than the other. In fact, they rattle quite a bit when you shake them. Let's take a listen here. And now the Miyoo Mini Plus. Now, I don't know how much you're going to be shaking your handheld, but if that is something that's important to you, then the Miyoo Mini Plus is basically silent. Now, when it comes to overall ergonomics and comfort, I would say that neither of these devices are going to be winning any awards. And honestly, a lot of that just comes from having a vertical handheld in the first place. This is an inherently cramped kind of style. But with each of these devices, they do have a good place for your index finger, which does make it a little bit easier to hold. And overall, these feel very center balanced as well, and so it is pretty comfortable to hold this device. And honestly, it's about the same experience with the Miyoo Mini Plus. The main difference for me is that the Miyoo Mini Plus feels a little bit more blocky to me than the Anbernic. And a lot of that has to do with the kind of sharper angle that we have here at the edges. And then the fact that overall this is just a thicker device too, and you can really feel that when you're holding it and playing it. And again, I don't think it's really a bad thing. In fact, it's quite nostalgic. It reminds me of holding an old Game Boy. But I would say between the two, the more rounded back end here on the Anbernic 35XX just does feel a little bit more comfortable. Okay, let's take a look at the rest. So up top on the Miyoo Mini, we have a power button and LED indicator. And then on the Anbernic, we have a mini HDMI port as well as LEDs too. Now there's nothing on the right side for the Miyoo Mini, but on the Anbernic, we have both our power and reset buttons, as well as 2 micro SD card slots. The beauty of this is that you can load up the firmware on the first SD card slot and then put your games on the second. Or if you'd like, you can just put everything on one single card. But as I'll show you later in the video, having a dual SD card setup like this has some additional benefits too. On the bottom, both devices have a headphone jack and USB charging port, and the Miyoo Mini Plus has a single SD card slot here as well. Finally, on the left side, both of these devices have up and down volume rockers, and these are both clicky micro switches here. Now, out of the box, both of these devices will come preloaded with games on an SD card, which also houses its stock firmware. And we'll take a look at the Anbernic stock firmware first. The setup here is very simple. You basically can just navigate to your games and then pick your system and then play your games from there. Now, the organization of these games is not great. For example, each of them have a number assigned to them instead of alphabetical order. And the numbering system here is kind of haphazard. For example, on the NES system, you'd have to go down 45 positions to find Kirby's Adventure. And so you'd basically have to memorize the location of each of these games if you wanted to play them. In the end, it's probably a minor inconvenience if you stick with the stock firmware over the fact that it's just relatively plug and play. Overall, I found the stock experience to be relatively limiting, but that may not matter to you if you just want to get into your games. And from that perspective, it is pretty easy. You would just choose the game, start it right up, and then you have a set of options if you press the menu button right here. And really, that's about it when it comes to the Anbernic firmware. Now on the Miyoo Mini, the stock experience is a little bit more upgraded. For example, the icons just look a little bit nicer and you can navigate through your systems just like this. And this one also comes preloaded with games, and I will say that the game collection is much better on the Miyoo Mini Plus than on the Anbernic. For starters, it's very comprehensive. You'll find hundreds of games available, and they are all in alphabetical order. Additionally, the Miyoo Mini Plus has some better options under the hood, like the ability to load up a custom RetroArch core for specific games. Also, the Miyoo Mini Plus has the ability to change the color parameters for the device, which is unique for this system. And so if you want to adjust things like the gamma or the saturation, you can do all of that directly within the settings. Now, if you're familiar with any of my other videos, you know that I always love to use custom firmware on my devices, just because I think community-based software is always going to be better than what the manufacturer can create. And luckily for both of these devices, we have some really great options. The Anbernic has GarlicOS, and the Miyoo Mini Plus has OnionOS. And we're going to start with OnionOS. This one's been around for about a year at this point, because it was first available for the original Miyoo Mini. And as of making this video, the Miyoo Mini Plus software has not been released yet, but I'm using a test version right here. Now at first glance, this looks very similar to the stock firmware. After all, you have these little icons to go into your systems, then start up a game. But once you start up a game, things get really interesting. For example, if you press the menu button, it'll bring you back to a game switcher kind of function. And within here, you'll be able to navigate through your most recently played games. And they're also working on some really neat new features. Let me show off a couple right here. For example, if you hold down menu and press the start button, you can toggle the different aspect ratios right there on the fly while playing a game. And so depending on what game you're playing and what aspect ratio you prefer, you actually have a very wide gamut right here. And so that's really handy in the fact that you don't have to go back into the menu. Additionally, they're going to be introducing some per game options. So for example, if we press the Y button while in a menu, we'll then have the ability to reset the save state or then also change the emulator core as well. This will be really great if one game plays better with a specific core over the others. Additionally, they've done some really great work with the search function. For this, all you have to do is press the X button while in the menu. And so, for example, if I try to search for the word Mario, it's going to bring up every game that has the word Mario in it. Overall, in my collection right here, I have 27. And I have a couple options here. For example, if I want to just look at every game in alphabetical order, I could do that. Or I could also look at them specific to each system. So I think that's pretty handy if you just want to grab a game quickly. Additionally, because OnionOS has been in development for so long, it has many extra features to it. For example, you can manually set the internal clock on the system for Pokemon games and things like that. But they've also introduced other standalone apps like a video player and then also a new FTP server. This is really exciting because the Miyoo Mini Plus has a Wi-Fi chip inside. Some other apps that are pretty handy are a music player as well as a PDF reader if you wanted to, for example, consult a map. And there's also an ebook reader available as well. One of my other favorite apps is the theme app. This will allow you to switch between 20 different preloaded themes that they have available. And you can always grab more directly from their website. Now, in addition to the standard emulators, there's also what they call the expert mode. And here you can find standalone emulators, and some of these are pretty neat. For example, the Advanced MAME one has this new advanced menu, which allows you to browse through these games using these video previews. And honestly, it's a pretty cool experience, especially with arcade games, to be able to navigate a menu like this. In fact, I found myself choosing to play games that I'd never heard of before, but they looked pretty cool. It reminds me a lot of actually walking through an arcade and choosing a game like that. Either way, these are all features that are in development with a new version of OnionOS that should be available for both the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus soon. Now, like I mentioned, this device has a Wi-Fi chip and the other one doesn't, and that's going to open up a lot of possibilities. For example, the OnionOS team has already been working on these 7 different functionalities right here. Like I already mentioned, you'll be able to transfer files wirelessly through the FTP app, and that'll be really convenient if you don't want to take out your SD card and put it in a computer. Additionally, they're working on a way to resync up the time every time you start up the device using the Wi-Fi, and that essentially will give you a real-time clock functionality. Additionally, they're working on the ability to update your device over the air and also be able to browse and download new themes. And finally, some other features in the works are the ability to back up your save states over the air, and then also to use retro achievements, and then to log into NetPlay to play with your friends. Now, each of these features are in varying states of development, but last I saw, both retro achievements and NetPlay have been considered working with the Miyoo Mini Plus. And so I would expect to see a rollout of these features here very soon. Now on the flip side, with the Anbernic RG35XX, we have GarlicOS. This firmware has been out for a couple months at this point, so it's still relatively early in development. But all the same, I would still consider this to be very mature. And from both a naming and design perspective, they took a lot of cues from OnionOS, and I think that's really cool. So for example, you can browse through your most recently played game and then start them up directly from here. There's also a favorites menu, and it's relatively easy to set up box art for all of your menu navigation as well. I have a starter guide for that, and I'll also leave it linked below. In the end, I really enjoy the navigation experience on both of these firmwares. At the most basic level, all you're really doing here is just navigating to whatever system you want to play and then pick your game and start it right up. The nice thing is that with each of these games, it's very easy to get in and out of your games. All you have to do is press the menu button and it'll bring you right back to wherever you were. Now, GarlicOS does have a couple features under the hood that are unique to this device. For example, this one already has a real-time clock embedded into it. So all you have to do here is just press start and then set up your time once, and then after that, everything will work fine. The device also has some very handy overclocking features. To set this up, all you have to do is press the select button while in the menu, and this will bring up a variety of options. You can choose either a moderate or maximum overclock by using the plus buttons, or you could also do an underclock if you want to save battery life as well. And so if you are playing a game that just needs a little bit more boost in power, this is the way you would set it up. For example, Yoshi's Island is one of the hardest Super Nintendo games to emulate. And that's especially true with this level right here. In fact, it dips down to 57 frames per second relatively often. And that is going to result in some audio and video stutters as well. Now, if we use the overclock, those stutters go away. It's still going to drop down to like 58 frames per second here and there, but it's still a very smooth experience overall. Another great example here is going to be Bloody Roar 2 on the PS1. This game is generally considered to be the hardest game to emulate in that catalog, and as you can see here, with the overclock on, we are getting a stable 60 frames per second. So what this means to me is that no matter what game you try to play on any of the systems available on GarlicOS, they will play at full speed. And so I think that's a good segue to move over to the next portion, which is a performance comparison between these two devices. And honestly, this might be the least interesting aspect of this video overall, because in the end, both of these handhelds are very good at emulating the systems they're intended to emulate. And in a nutshell, that means that any of your handheld systems, as well as 8-bit and 16-bit systems, are all going to play just fine. Even when moving over to a 32-bit system like Sega 32X or the PlayStation 1, every game I've tried has played perfectly fine here on the GarlicOS. When it comes to arcade games, you should be able to play all of the 80s and 90s classics, so that includes things like Neo Geo, and then mostly all of the arcade systems up to the mid-90s. And so really, this is just an assurance of the fact that the RG35XX will be able to play all the games it's supposed to. And it's a very similar experience on OnionOS on the Miyoo Mini Plus as well. Now there are a couple slight differences. For example, with OnionOS, they do have the ability to add overlays for Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and these look really nice. Additionally, they've added a bunch of different new color palettes for Game Boy in particular. And so no matter what you prefer when it comes to Game Boy palettes, you should be able to find something that fits your style. Now from a performance standpoint, it's going to be relatively the same between OnionOS and GarlicOS. And so that means all your handheld systems and your 8-bit and 16-bit systems, these are all going to play just great. Even the harder to play Super Nintendo games like Yoshi's Island will play great. In fact, if you turn on fast forward with this game, you're going to get about 120 frames per second. To me, that's a good indication that we have a lot of headroom here and that the whole game will play really smoothly. When it comes to arcade, it's going to be able to play all those same systems that you can on GarlicOS. And really, the only difference I could find was for PlayStation 1, and I had to look really hard to find a difference here. When it comes to your standard PlayStation titles, like Final Fantasy X right here, they're all going to play just fine. And so if you really want to dive deep into a role-playing game or an adventure game, they should work just out of the box with OnionOS. Even some of the harder to play games like Tekken 3 still play at full speed within the default core. To be honest, the only game I found any sort of difference was Bloody Roar 2. If you play this just with the default core in OnionOS, you will get maybe about 55 frames per second on average. And that's definitely going to result in some stutters here and there. Now personally, I'm not a huge fan of this game, I just use it for benchmarking, but if you really wanted to play Bloody Roar 2, there is a means within OnionOS. And for that, we're going to go back to that expert mode, and there is a standalone PS1 emulator right here. And if you use it with this standalone emulator, you will get between 59 and 60 frames per second the entire time. I maybe heard a glitch here and there every once in a while, but overall I would say this is very playable here. In the end, I would say that every single game within each of these catalogs are going to be playable on each of these devices. It just so happens that with OnionOS, you have to use one specific emulator for this one specific game. And finally, another feature I really like about both of these systems is that they can power off while in a game and it'll save your state and then you can resume it right then and there. To do that, all you have to do is just shut it down, then wait a moment, and then when you power it up, it'll start right up. And the boot times to jump back into a game are just about the same between these two. So when it comes to pick up and play, the experience will be identical between these two devices. Now, as these devices get more popular, we should see more custom firmware options in the future. For example, as of just a few days ago, there was a beta release of MinUI. And if you've been involved in this hobby for a while, you may be familiar with this already. After all, this was also available on the original Miyoo Mini and then a couple TrimUI devices as well. Now the nice thing about this one is that it's intended to be very, very simple. In fact, all you can do is just navigate through your games and boot them right up. However, there is a lot of power under the hood for this one as well. For example, if you press the menu buttons, you'll get your typical set of options right here, but you will see that the options menu has been reworked from the ground up. Within here, you'll be able to do things like adjust the screen scaling and overlays, and you can also do some emulator-specific option changes as well. And many of these are actually very similar to what you can find within RetroArch, but the menu I found for this is much more intuitive. And probably the coolest thing about this is that you can save these on a per-game basis if you'd like. And so if you'd like to have a specific overlay or aspect ratio or anything else like that for a specific game, you can do this without having to get into RetroArch. And so I'm really excited to see this one here, and I'm going to keep my eye on it in the future. Okay, so now that we've gotten through custom firmware and performance, I think you deserve a break. And I think it's going to be a cat break this time. Now for those of you who are new to the channel, I used to do a lot of cat breaks with my cat Chicken right here, because she used to always jump on my lap when I was working on these videos. Now sadly, she's been sick for a while now, and so she doesn't visit me that much anymore. Part of that has to do with the fact that frankly, she just doesn't really like me that much anymore, and that's because I have to force feed her medications twice a day. In the end, I'm very thankful that she's happy, but all the same, you probably won't see a lot of cat breaks here going into the future. But I think you'll agree that this is a worthy sacrifice to maintain her health. Anyway, this was a rather long and sentimental cat break, so let's get back to the video. Next, I want to talk about some of the unique features of the 35XX. After all, this one lacks Wi-Fi, but it has a couple other neat things too. For example, with GarlicOS, if you have a dual card setup, you can actually use a OnionOS SD card as your second card here. And so as an example, I'm going to pull out the card from my Miyoo Mini Plus and then put it in my 35XX. And just like that, it boots up and it registers all of the ROMs. Now you're not going to see the box art here because I don't have it added on this specific card, but as you can see, I can navigate through the games and then start them right up. And probably the coolest feature about this is that these save games also were compatible between the two. So for example, right here with Yoshi's Island, this is the save game that I had for my Miyoo Mini Plus, now playing on my Anbernic. And it's going to work vice versa. If I put the card back in my Miyoo Mini Plus and I start up Illusion of Gaia again, you can see it starts right back up where I closed it out last time on my Anbernic device. And so that's going to be super cool if you happen to own a Miyoo Mini or a Miyoo Mini Plus. Another thing the 35XX has that the other doesn't is an HDMI out port. And this will work with both the stock firmware as well as GarlicOS. Now there is one drawback to this setup in the fact that it will scale to full screen of whatever you're plugging it into. And so for example, with my 16:9 monitor, as you can see, we're getting a 16:9 screen. And so while it is pretty neat that you'll be able to play your games on a larger screen like a TV, it's still not quite a perfect experience in the fact that everything's going to be a little bit squished. Okay, next up I want to do some audio and video testing, and I waited to do this later into the video because I wanted to do it with custom firmware installed. Let's start with the audio first and with the RG35XX. Next, here is the Miyoo Mini. And I would say between the two, I definitely prefer the 35XX. It's much clearer and louder than the other. Now when it comes to screen comparison, there's a couple factors to think about. Number one, GarlicOS has a bunch of really innovative scaling tweaks that they have inside. This means you're going to have nice and balanced pixels while still keeping a very sharp image. Now OnionOS also does some very good scaling, but it's not quite as sharp. And so between the two, I would say the 35XX is a little bit more crisp. Now when it comes to color balance, I think these are also both very good. The big difference here is that the 35XX cannot be tweaked, but all the same, by default, it looks very nice. Now here on the Miyoo Mini, I'm still using the default settings, but you can adjust them if you'd like as well. And so I would say in comparison between the two, the Miyoo Mini screen probably has an upper edge when it comes to color balance. Now I don't want to spend too much time on this, but here's a quick teardown of the two devices. As you can see, the 35XX does have a 2100 mAh battery, and this is what the board is going to look like. You can see the 4 shoulder buttons right here, and then the CPU is housed under this heatsink right here to keep things relatively cool. Opening up the Miyoo Mini is a very similar experience, you just have to take the battery out first. And this one is different from the original in the fact that it does have clips on each side to hold it into place. I think this partially might be why the device feels so sturdy in the hands. Additionally, the PCB is actually secured into place by 2 additional screws, but I did want to take a look at the inside here because this is a relatively new release. And overall, the setup here is relatively clean, but the two things I want to bring your attention to is the Wi-Fi chip up here on the top, as well as this metal antenna. And then also on the bottom below the D-pad, you can see this small rumble motor as well. And really that's about it when it comes to the teardown. These are both relatively easy devices to take apart. Another question a lot of people have are different charging options for these two devices, so let's do a test right here. Now the standard USB-A to USB-C cable will work just fine under 5 or a 10 watt load. And so you could charge this directly from one of those old phone chargers or from like a PC or one of those smart chargers that know exactly how much voltage to give. Now I also tried it with a USB-C to USB-C cable with a 25 watt charger brick. This is the kind you would find for something like a tablet. And yeah, this charges on both of these devices as well. I also tried it with my standalone 45 watt Steam Deck charger. And as you can see here, this one also charges correctly for both of these too. In fact, the only one I couldn't get to work properly was a 65 watt charger. Again, this one's meant for something like a mini PC or a laptop, and so I wouldn't recommend charging it with this one. As you can see, it will not work. But for other USB-C setups, it looks like both of these are going to work just fine. Now, I wouldn't expect these to do any sort of fast charging, but all the same, you can use a variety of different plugs and cables if you'd like. Alright, we've gone through a lot at this point, so let's go ahead and start wrapping things up. We'll start with a tally of the different scores that I made for each of these systems. And I think I demonstrated these pretty well throughout the video, but let's just go over them real quickly. To start, for the display, I did rank the Miyoo Mini Plus just a little bit higher than the 35XX. And that has to do with the fact that you can adjust the color profile, which I think is going to be important for certain people. Either way, I think they're both very good displays. In terms of audio, I think the 35XX is just a little bit better, but they're both not great. And for buttons, I think they're both very good, but I did give the Miyoo Mini Plus better scores just for the fact that the D-pad is a little bit more accurate and it doesn't rattle when you shake it. And when it came to overall ergonomics, I ended up picking the Miyoo Mini Plus. I think the 35XX is comfortable in the fact that it's a little bit more rounded, but I do like the fact that the shoulder buttons are a little bit smaller and the device is a little bit thicker too, which gives it a more classic retro feel. And bear in mind that I wouldn't consider either of these handhelds to be insanely comfortable by virtue of being vertically oriented. Now when it comes to software, I do think that OnionOS has an edge over GarlicOS, but that mostly has to do with the fact that it has a 1-year lead time when it comes to development. And so right now there's just a lot more apps that are available within OnionOS, but GarlicOS could very well catch up. When it came to performance, they're both very good, but I did give a slight edge to the 35XX. Now granted, these can both play about the same amount of games, but the Anbernic device has a little bit more raw power. In addition, you have to make a few tweaks on the OnionOS side in order to get every game to play perfectly. For example, with PS1, you may have to use a standalone emulator for certain games. And overall, that experience of having to jump through different types of menus for certain games is just not quite as seamless as it is on the Anbernic device. Now when it comes to battery life, I think that they're both pretty good. About 4 hours is all I'd ever really want in a handheld. But the Miyoo Mini Plus does have a larger battery, and so I would expect about 6 hours of gameplay here. Now when it comes to additional features, this was a little bit tough because they do have some unique things to them, but they are not the same. For example, with the 35XX, you have that dual SD card setup, and that is pretty cool if you have, for example, an OnionOS card that you can use in the second card slot. Additionally, if you are interested in having an HDMI output, then the 35XX has that. On the other hand, I think that Miyoo did a really great job with adding Wi-Fi to the Mini Plus. I really think that 6 months from now, once everything is implemented, this is going to be a very killer feature. Now one variable I think is going to adjust over time is availability. After all, the RG35XX has been out for about 3 months at this point, and so it's widely available everywhere. Meanwhile, pre-orders for the Miyoo Mini Plus have already pushed back an additional month, and based on the fulfillment issues we had with the original Miyoo Mini, I think it's going to be a while before the Miyoo Mini Plus will be readily available. And finally, when it comes to value, I think they're both very good, but the Anbernic is a little bit cheaper than the other right now. I would expect to pay about $65 for the 35XX and about $70 or more for the Miyoo Mini Plus. Now I'm not one to put a lot of stock in an overall tally, but as you can see right here, the Miyoo Mini Plus did win by just 1 point. But of course there's more to it than just one singular score that I came up with in my own subjective opinion. After all, the whole point of this video is to see whether or not this device is going to be a good fit for you. And so to help in that decision, I brought out 2 of my friends right here, and this is Veronica and Jeffrey, and you may have seen them in previous videos. Now for this video here, they each have a specific use case, so let's talk about those. We're going to start with Veronica first. Now she is someone who considers handhelds to be a hobby. She already owns a couple of them already, but she's really been eyeing getting one of these really nice vertical handhelds as well. She's also the type of person that doesn't really mind tinkering, so she likes the idea of swapping out the buttons on her device, and she also doesn't mind getting into the settings to find that perfect setup for each of her games. Additionally, she gets a little bit excited when she hears about other things that a device can do other than playing retro games. For example, the idea of using it as an MP3 player is kind of cool. Additionally, she's interested in finding out some of the other opportunities that can unlock by having custom firmware with Wi-Fi enabled. And finally, because she is a collector, she doesn't really mind having to hunt down the device overall. For example, she already has an AliExpress account, and she doesn't mind staying up late to refresh her screen to grab the right device at the right time. Now, you've already probably figured out which device is a better fit for her, but let's move over to Jeffrey first. Now, Jeffrey is a different story. This is the kind of guy who just wants to play games. After all, he has a really busy job as a museum curator, and so when he gets home, he doesn't want to mess around with a computer, he just wants to play his retro favorites. Additionally, he doesn't really consider himself to be very tech savvy. If anything, he knows how to flash custom firmware, but that's about it. Really, all he wants is just a menu that he can jump in and out of his games with ease. And finally, he kind of likes the idea of hooking this device up to a TV so he can play on a larger screen. After all, staring at a bunch of museum items all day have made his eyes pretty tired, and so he'd rather just kind of look at a bigger screen. And again, because he really just wants to play his old favorites, he doesn't really care about things like aspect ratio either. And so, as you can imagine, for Jeffrey, I would recommend the Anbernic RG35XX. To get the most out of this system, I would highly recommend flashing GarlicOS, and I have an entire guide for that on my website. And I think after you've done that, you're basically covered from then on out. It's a very simple system to navigate, and so because of that, once you've loaded up with your favorite games, you're going to be good to go. Now, as you've probably guessed, for Veronica, I think that the Miyoo Mini Plus is going to be a better fit. The buttons on the Miyoo Mini are the same as on the Miyoo Mini Plus, which means there's already a bunch of custom options already out there. And so it's going to be really easy to customize the hardware for her needs. Additionally, there are going to be a ton of hidden treasures to find within OnionOS on her Miyoo Mini Plus. And if she happens to already own a Miyoo Mini, at some point these two will have a single release too, so she can swap between her two SD cards as well. Either way, she'll have access to a ton of different apps from the get-go, and the additional features that'll unlock from Wi-Fi are going to be really interesting for her as well. And so if you want the combination of a relatively simple interface but then some really deep customization options within, I think that the Miyoo Mini Plus and OnionOS is the way to go. Now you're also probably wondering which one I prefer between the two as well. And I was actually surprised to find that my choice between the two was the Anbernic RG35XX. And I think that has to do with the fact that I identify most with the Veronica, but probably to like the millionth degree. In the end, I spent a lot of my time working on these devices, and when it comes to actually playing them, I prefer a more simple setup. And for me, I think the GarlicOS experience scratches that itch almost perfectly. I love the fact that it's very simple and beautiful to navigate as well. And sometimes having fewer options is better. And so when it comes to actual game time, I've found that I've played the Anbernic more than the Miyoo Mini lately. Now that being said, I do reserve the right to change my mind, especially when retro achievements become available on the Miyoo Mini Plus. That one feature alone might be enough to push me over the edge for that one in favor of the Anbernic. Either way, I think I've made it abundantly clear over this very long video that both of these devices are well worth your time and money. At the end of the day, it's really going to come down to your use case and how much time you want to spend within the operating system versus with the device itself. If you want something that's super solid to play all of your games and is also readily available, I think the Anbernic is a better choice. But if you don't mind the hunt for the Miyoo Mini Plus, you might find that all of those features are going to be worth it to you as well. Either way, that's about it for this video, and I appreciate you taking the time to help me share my love in these little handheld devices. Because in the end, the most important thing here is to play your favorite retro games, and these will both do that very well. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.